418 people burned to death in 4 hours on September 1st, 1894. Not over days, not scattered across a region, but concentrated in 6 small towns in east-central Minnesota. Towns that were functioning communities at 2 in the afternoon and fields of ash by 6 in the evening. The fire moved faster than trains, faster than horses, faster than people could run. It generated temperatures hot enough to melt glass, to ignite buildings from radiant heat before the flames even arrived, to create a firestorm that consumed oxygen and suffocated people in wells and basements where they'd sought refuge. And the fuel for this fire, the reason it burned with such intensity and speed, was not a natural accumulation of forest debris. It was logging slash, the waste from decades of timber cutting, branches and tops and unmarketable wood left in piles that covered acres, that stood waist deep and higher in the forests surrounding the towns. The logging companies had known the slash was a fire hazard. They had been warned by foresters, by insurance companies, by residents, and they had done nothing, because cleaning up the slash was expensive, and fire was, in their calculation, an acceptable risk. On September 1st, the risk materialized. The Hinckley fire burned 400 square miles, destroyed 6 towns completely, killed 418 people, and orphaned 93 children. And it was entirely preventable. This is the story of the Hinckley fire, the disaster that shouldn't have happened, the 4 hours that turned towns into crematoriums, and the escapes that saved hundreds, while hundreds more died. Let's start with the setting, because understanding where Hinckley was and why it existed explains why the fire was so devastating. Hinckley was a town of about 1,200 people in Pine County, east-central Minnesota, roughly 80 miles north of St. Paul. It was a railroad town, sitting on the St. Paul and Duluth Railroad line. And it was a logging town, surrounded by forests of white pine that were being cut at a ferocious rate in the 1880s and 90s. The surrounding communities, Sandstone, Mission Creek, Pokegama, Brook Park, Miller, were similar. Small towns and settlements dependent on logging, connected by the railroad, populated by immigrant families, Scandinavians, Germans, Irish, working in the mills and the camps. The economy was timber. The forests were being cleared, the logs were being milled, and the lumber was being shipped south and east. The towns existed because of the timber, and they were surrounded by the evidence of the cutting, the stumps and the slash. Logging slash is the waste material left after commercial timber is removed. When a tree is felled and bucked, the loggers take the trunk, the straight, valuable section that can be milled into lumber. The branches, the top of the tree, sections with knots or defects, all of it is left on the forest floor. In a small-scale operation, this isn't a major issue. The slash decomposes over years, returning nutrients to the soil. But in an industrial logging operation, the kind happening in Minnesota in the late 19th century, the slash accumulates at a scale that is incomprehensible. Imagine cutting every tree in a square mile of forest. The slash from that cutting, if left in place, would cover the ground to a depth of several feet, in some places higher, a tangle of branches and wood that is impenetrable and highly flammable. Now imagine doing that over hundreds of square miles, over decades, and leaving the slash where it falls. By the summer of 1894, the forests around Hinckley were not forests in the traditional sense. They were slash fields, waist-deep to head-high accumulations of dead, dry wood, interspersed with stumps and the occasional standing tree that hadn't been cut yet. The volume of slash was staggering. Estimates based on the area logged and the typical waste ratio suggest millions of tons of wood, dried by the sun, seasoned by years of exposure, ready to burn. The logging companies knew it was a hazard. There are records, correspondence, insurance reports that document the concern. Foresters warned that the slash created an extreme fire risk. Insurance companies raised premiums or refused to cover properties in slash-heavy areas. Residents complained that the slash was everywhere, that small fires were common, that it was only a matter of time before a major fire occurred. The company's response was economic calculation. Cleaning up the slash, hauling it away, or burning it in controlled conditions was expensive. It required labor, time, and equipment. The timber had already been extracted. The slash had no value. Spending money to remove it reduced profit margins, and fires, while possible, were not guaranteed. The companies accepted the risk, implicitly, by doing nothing. The slash remained. The summer of 1894 was one of the driest on record in Minnesota. From May through August, rainfall was minimal. Wells ran low. Creeks dried up. The forests, already stressed by the logging, were desiccated. The slash, exposed to months of sun and heat and low humidity, was as dry as kindling. Small fires were common that summer, ignited by lightning, by sparks from trains, by campfires, by the logging operations themselves. Most were small, controlled or extinguished before they spread. But the conditions were building toward catastrophe. By late August, fires were burning near Hinckley and the surrounding towns. Smoke was constant, thick enough that residents were accustomed to it, that it seemed normal. On August 31st, the fires were larger, closer, and the smoke was heavier. Some residents were uneasy, but there was no panic, no evacuation. Where would they go? The towns were isolated, surrounded by forest and slash. The railroad was the only way out, and the trains ran on schedule, not on demand. The belief, or the hope, was that the fires would miss the towns, that the wind would shift, that rain would come. September 1st dawned hot, dry, and windy. Early afternoon, the situation was changing rapidly, but the realization that this was different, that this was catastrophic, came too late for many. The fire advanced on Hinckley and the other towns with a speed that defied understanding and experience. A normal wildfire, even a fast one, moves at a pace a person can match, can run from, can sometimes outrun. But the Hinckley fire was not a normal wildfire. It was a firestorm. A self-sustaining convective system driven by the immense heat and the unlimited fuel of the slash. The fire's speed in the final hours was estimated, based on survivor accounts and the timing of events, at over 60 miles per hour in some sections. Faster than the trains, faster than horses, faster than any human response. The heat was extreme. At the fire front, temperatures reached 1,000 to 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to ignite wood without direct flame contact, hot enough to melt glass and metal. The radiant heat, the heat projected ahead of the flames, was lethal at distances of 500 feet or more. People caught in the open, even if the flames hadn't reached them, were burned by the radiant heat, their clothes igniting, their skin blistering. The fire also consumed oxygen. In a large, intense fire, the combustion process uses oxygen faster than the air can replenish it. The result is a localized zone of low oxygen, and people in that zone, even if they weren't burned, suffocated. Survivors described gasping for air, feeling like they were drowning, the smoke so thick and the oxygen so depleted that breathing was impossible. The fire created its own weather, a phenomenon observed in large fires. The heat generated massive updrafts, convection currents that pulled air into the fire at ground level and pushed smoke and embers thousands of feet into the air. These updrafts created winds, inward-flowing winds that fed the fire, and outward-blowing winds from the convection column. The fire was generating wind speeds of 30, 40, 50 miles per hour, winds that knocked people down, that carried embers miles ahead of the main fire, that started new fires in advance of the front. This is a firestorm, a fire so large and so hot that it becomes self-sustaining. Burn. At 2 in the afternoon, Hinckley was a functioning town. People were going about their Saturday activities, working, shopping, preparing for the weekend. The smoke was heavy, the fires were visible to the south, but there was no official warning, no evacuation order. Some residents, sensing danger, began to leave on their own, walking to the train station, hoping to catch a train out. By 3, the situation was clearly dire. Embers were falling on the town, igniting small fires in roofs and yards. The smoke was choking, visibility dropping. The sound of the fire, a roar like a continuous train or a waterfall, was audible, growing louder. By 4, the fire was entering the town from the south and west, moving faster than anyone could react. The flames were a wall, 100 feet high, advancing. At approximately 4:15, 2 trains were in Hinckley. One was a passenger train heading south toward St. Paul, and the other was a mixed train, passengers and freight, heading north toward Duluth. The engineer of the Duluth-bound train was James Root, a veteran railroader who understood immediately that the town was doomed, and that the only chance of survival for the people was to get on the trains and get out. Root made a decision that would save hundreds of lives and cost him his health. He would load as many people as possible onto his train and drive south, back toward the fire, to reach a place he knew, Skunk Lake, a body of water 6 miles south where people could take refuge. Driving south meant driving directly into the flames, through the fire front, with a train loaded with terrified passengers and wooden cars that would ignite if the heat was too intense. Root ordered the train loaded. Hundreds of people swarmed the train, climbing into passenger cars, into freight cars, onto the roof, clinging to the sides. The train was overcrowded beyond capacity, but Root didn't stop the boarding. He knew that anyone left behind would die. At approximately 4:30, Root's train pulled out of Hinckley, heading south into the fire. The conditions inside the train were hellish. The heat was intense, the wooden cars were smoking, passengers were beating out flames with blankets and clothing. The air was unbreathable, thick with smoke. People were screaming, praying, suffocating. Root, in the locomotive cab, was driving blind. The smoke was so thick he couldn't see the track ahead. He was running at full throttle, the engine roaring, the train shaking, trusting that the track was clear and that he could make it through the fire zone before the train was consumed. The heat in the cab was unbearable. The metal was too hot to touch. Root and his firemen were being scalded by steam leaks, burned by radiant heat, blinded by smoke. Root's hands were blistering on the controls, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Stopping meant death for everyone on the train. 6 miles. The longest 6 miles of Root's life, and the lives of everyone on the train. The train emerged from the worst of the fire at Skunk Lake, a marshy area with standing water. Root stopped the train and the passengers stumbled off, collapsing into the water, submerging themselves, gasping for air. The train was smoking, charred, but intact. The passengers were burned, injured, traumatized, but alive. Root himself was severely injured. He was scalded, blinded temporarily by the heat and smoke, his hands burned. He would recover partially, but he was never the same. He was hailed as a hero, and he was, but the cost was his health. The people who couldn't get on Root's train, or who were in other parts of Hinckley, faced different choices, and most of those choices ended in death. Some tried to run, to outpace the fire. They didn't make it. The fire was too fast. Some sought refuge in buildings, in basements, thinking the structures would protect them. The buildings burned, and the people inside suffocated or burned. Some went to wells, lowering themselves into the water, hoping the fire would pass over. Some drowned when the water wasn't deep enough and they panicked. Some suffocated from the smoke that was sucked down into the wells, and some went to the gravel pit. The gravel pit was an excavation on the east edge of Hinckley, a man-made depression maybe 40 feet deep with water at the bottom from natural spring. It was known to locals, and as the fire approached, an estimated 300 people fled to the pit, climbing down the sides, wading into the water. The water was chest deep to neck deep for adults, deeper for children. The people submerged themselves as the fire raged overhead. The heat was intense, the air was smoke, and breathing required putting your face at water level, inhaling the small pocket of relatively cooler air just above the surface. The ordeal lasted hours. The fire burned over the pit, the heat radiating down, the smoke choking. People had to stay submerged, holding children above water, supporting the elderly, fighting water. But the river was also a trap. The current was strong, and some people, exhausted or injured, were swept away and drowned. Others, trying to stay submerged in shallow sections, were overcome by smoke or heat. The town itself was destroyed completely. 45 people died in sandstone, burned or drowned. Mission Creek, Pokegama, Brook Park, Miller, smaller communities, and isolated farms were hit by the fire in the late afternoon and evening. These areas had no trains, no organized evacuation, no refuges like the gravel pit. Families tried to flee, some on foot, some in wagons. The fire had burned itself out in most areas, having consumed all available fuel. The firestorm had lasted roughly 6 hours from the time it became uncontrollable to the time it exhausted the slash and reached areas that had already been burned or that were less fuel-dense. The smoke cleared slowly over the night and into the next day. September 2nd dawned on a landscape transformed. The rescuers, volunteers from St. Paul and Duluth, arrived by train on the morning of September 2nd, and what they found was apocalyptic. Hinckley was unrecognizable. The buildings were gone, reduced to ash and rubble. The trees were blackened stumps. The ground was still hot, smoldering, and the bodies were everywhere. In the streets, in the remains of basements, in wells, in the gravel pit, the bodies were burned, most beyond recognition. The heat had been so intense that flesh was consumed, bones were charred, and identification was nearly impossible in many cases. The rescuers and the survivors who returned worked to recover the bodies. It was grim work. Bodies were found in positions that told stories. Families huddled together in basements, parents shielding children, all dead from smoke or heat. People found in wells, drowned or suffocated. bodies in the gravel pit, some still in the water, some on the banks where they'd collapsed. Identification was done by location, by personal effects that survived the fire, by dental records in a few cases, and by the testimony of survivors who knew where people had been. Many bodies were never identified. They were buried in mass graves, marked only as unknown. The final death toll was established over days as the search expanded and as reports came in from the outlying areas. 418 confirmed dead. The number could be higher. Some people were listed as missing, assumed dead, but never found. Entire families were wiped out, leaving no one to report them missing. The children who survived but lost parents numbered 93, orphaned in a single day, ranging in age from infants to teenagers. These children were taken in by relatives if they had any in the area, or they were placed in orphanages and institutions, or they were adopted by families willing to take them. The long-term outcomes for these children varied. Some were placed in good homes and thrived despite the trauma. Others carried the psychological scars for life, the nightmares, the survivor's guilt, the grief of losing their families in such a horrific way. The relief effort was immediate and substantial. News of the fire reached St. Paul and Duluth within hours, and by September 2nd, aid was being organized. Trains carrying supplies, food, clothing, medical supplies, doctors and nurses arrived within a day. Donations poured in from across the country. The national press covered the disaster extensively, and the public response was generous. The survivors, those who had lost everything, were provided with temporary shelter, food, and financial assistance. The relief effort was coordinated by the Red Cross, which was a relatively new organization at the time, and by local governments and charitable groups. The reconstruction of Hinckley and the other towns was slow and incomplete. Some survivors chose to rebuild, to stay in the area despite the trauma. Others left, unable to face the memories, the ghosts of what had been. Hinckley was rebuilt, but it was smaller and in some ways different, with parts of the town relocated to areas considered safer. The investigation into the cause of the fire was straightforward in its findings and frustrating in its lack of accountability. The official determination, made by state investigators and confirmed by independent experts, was that the fire was caused by the combination of extreme drought, massive accumulations of logging slash, and multiple ignition sources. The ignition sources were likely sparks from locomotives, from logging equipment, or from small fires that were already burning and that merged and grew into the firestorm. The fuel, the logging slash, was identified unambiguously as the primary factor that made the fire so intense and so fast-moving. The responsibility was clear. The logging companies had created the conditions for the fire by leaving the slash in the forests. They had been warned repeatedly about the fire hazard, and they had done nothing. Internal documents from some of the companies, uncovered during the investigation, showed that the issue of slash cleanup had been discussed, that cost estimates had been prepared, and that the decision had been made not to proceed because the expense was not justified by the perceived risk. The risk calculation had been wrong, catastrophically wrong, and 418 people had paid the price. But there were no prosecutions. There was no legal framework at the time for holding corporations accountable for this kind of negligence. The concept of corporate manslaughter, of criminal liability for decisions that led to deaths, was not established in law. The families of the victims sued, some individually, some in groups, seeking compensation for the loss of life and property. The settlements were minimal, a few hundred or a few $1,000s per family, nowhere near adequate compensation for the loss of a parent, a spouse, a child. The logging companies, protected by the legal structure of the time, continued operations, and while some slash cleanup was initiated in the years following the fire, it was inadequate and inconsistent. The industry's response was defensive initially. The companies argued that the fire was an act of God, an unforeseeable natural disaster, that they could not be held responsible for weather and drought. This argument was undermined by the evidence that the slash was man-made. that the warnings had been explicit, and that the decision to leave the slash was a choice, not an inevitability. Over time, the industry's stance softened slightly, and some practices changed. Slash burning, controlled burning of logging waste, became more common, though it was not mandated universally for decades. Forestry science began to study fire behavior more systematically, and the Hinckley fire became a case study in the dangers of fuel accumulation and the importance of fire management. What remains today of the Hinckley fire is memory, memorials, and lessons that are still being learned and relearned. The Hinckley Fire Museum, located in Hinckley, preserves artifacts from the fire, photographs, survivor testimonies, and the history of the disaster. The museum includes a diorama of the gravel pit, oral histories recorded from survivors before they died, and exhibits on the logging industry and the conditions that led to the fire. The mass grave in the Hinckley Cemetery is marked by a monument listing the names of the known dead, 418 names, ages, families. It's a place of pilgrimage for descendants and for those interested in the history. An annual commemoration is held, attended by survivors' descendants, historians, and community members, keeping the memory alive. The survivors of the fire, those who lived through September 1st, 1894, carried physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. The physical injuries, burns, lung damage from smoke inhalation, injuries sustained during the escape, were visible and often disabling. The psychological trauma was profound. Survivors reported nightmares, flashbacks, an inability to tolerate smoke or fire, a pervasive anxiety. This was before the term PTSD existed. Through the fire, recovered partially from his injuries, but was left with permanent damage to his eyes and hands. He was celebrated as a hero, received awards and recognition, but he was also haunted by the knowledge that while he had saved hundreds more had died. He continued to work for the railroad until his injuries made it impossible, and he spent his later years in relative obscurity, dying in 1921. His grave is marked, and he is remembered in Hinckley as the man who saved the town, or at least the people who could fit on a train. The changes that came from the Hinckley fire were slow and incomplete. Fire safety laws were enacted in some states, requiring logging companies to clean up slash or to burn it in controlled conditions. But enforcement was weak, and in many areas, the practices continued largely unchanged. It took additional fires, other disasters, the Peshtigo fire of 1871, which killed more people, the Cloquet fire of 1918, which burned a similar area, before the lessons were codified into consistent policy and practice. Forestry science evolved to understand fire behavior, fire ecology, and the importance of fuel management. But the evolution was gradual, and even today, the debate over land management practices, controlled burns, and fire risk continues. The Hinckley fire is a case study in preventable disaster, in the consequences of prioritizing profit over safety, and in the human cost of decisions made in boardrooms far from the people who would pay the price. Caught in the streets as the fire consumed them. Here's to the 93 children, orphaned in 4 hours, who grew up without parents, who carried the trauma of that day for the rest of their lives. Here's to James Root, who drove a train through fire and saved hundreds at the cost of his health. Here's to the survivors who rebuilt, who stayed, who refused to let the fire erase Hinckley entirely. And here's to the logging companies that left the slash, that ignored the warnings, that calculated the risk and chose profit, and that were never held accountable. The fire burned for 4 hours, but the consequences lasted lifetimes. Hinckley was rebuilt, but it was never the same. The forests grew back, but they were different. And the memory, the knowledge that 418 people died because someone decided that cleaning up waste was too expensive, that remains. The Hinckley fire is not just history. It's a warning, a lesson in what happens when we ignore the experts, when we accept risk on behalf of others, when we value profit over people. The lesson has been learned and forgotten and learned again, in fires that followed, in disasters that repeated the pattern. And the question remains, how many times do we need to relearn it before it sticks?